Hello, and welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. Viking homosexuality. Now, while that may not be a burning topic of debate in every public bar, it is nonetheless an interesting and usually ignored subject as far as the Vikings, or well, more correctly, the Norse people, are concerned. And it's one I don't recall ever having heard discussed. So, did homosexuality exist in the Viking Age? And if it did, what was the reaction to it among the people? And how did it fit in with their religious beliefs? Actually, that's not a hard question, though it might seem to be at first sight. And the answer is yes, it did. Can I prove that? Well, not in terms of documentation. Like there's an inscription on a runestone somewhere from Eric the Bloodthirsty that he lusts after Ivar the Skullcrusher. No, nothing like that exists. But I don't need documented proof, since logic and medical science and historical fact establish it for me. Homosexuality existed in every age of human history. The Middle Ages, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Stone Age, prehistory. We even have an account of a homosexual relationship written in cuneiform on Babylonian clay tablets dating from the 3rd millennium BC, telling the story of King Gilgamesh of Uruk and his lover Enkidu, whom he loved as a woman. And the great poet of ancient Greece, Sappho of Lesbos, known as the 10th Muse, is history's first recorded lesbian, living circa 630 to 570 BC. And the term lesbian, in fact, coming from her island home of Lesbos, and actually meaning just a resident of that island. It has no sexual connotation. You could actually say that every man, woman, and child on that island is a lesbian. But given all that, obviously homosexuality existed in the Viking Age. Now, there are those who seem to think it was invented during the 19th century by Oscar Wilde, strolling down Oxford Street in a beautiful velvet suit with a green carnation in his buttonhole. Of course, that is total rubbish. Homosexuality has existed as long as sexuality itself. Ugg the caveman looked with desire at other cavemen, and Uggette, the cave woman, did the same with other cave women. Homosexuality is a natural thing. It occurs among many species of animals as well as humans. And they, of course, couldn't invent it nor decide to try it just for fun. It was a natural thing to them, just as it was and is to humans. It is an integral part of sexuality and always has been. So we can say homosexuality existed in the Viking Age just as it has in every other age. But it is never mentioned in any detail as such in any of the Norse sagas. There are no actual records of homosexual couples of either sex in that time. Though, as with many things in the sagas and the old poems, we can infer things, reading between the lines, so to speak. Of course, nor for that matter is heterosexual sex a topic that makes more than a very brief appearance in the sagas either. Marriage and having children, yes, or avoiding doing so for that matter, but sex itself, no. There are no how to do it descriptions, if you like. It is assumed rather than stated, which I suppose is logical enough. I mean, if you have children, well then presumably you've done what was biologically required to achieve that result. And of course, all our information about Norse culture, religion, and customs comes down to us not from the Viking Age itself, when people were actually doing those things, but rather from the 13th century, more than 200 years later. And it was written by Christians, whose views on many subjects, including, of course, anything to do with sex and homosexuality in particular, would probably have been very different from what pagan people would have thought about it. Now, yes, many old poems recounted in the Poetic Edda, for example, would have dated from hundreds of years previously, some from, well, even before the so-called Viking Age, usually dated as 793 to 1066 AD. Poems and stories from the Vendel period that preceded it. But they were verbal tales to begin with. They were recounted by travelling poets and storytellers called skalds, handed down by word of mouth. But their presence in the Codex Regius, or the Royal Book, an Icelandic document compiled circa 1270 AD, is due to the Christians who finally wrote them down. So their age doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter that some of them date hundreds of years before Christian times. They still can't be seen as truly indicative of the beliefs of the Norse people in those prior times, because we often have no idea what may have been altered or even omitted altogether to suit a Christian viewpoint. Now, sometimes it's obvious, a Christian concept that we know could not have existed in Old Norse beliefs, but others are not so obvious, and they can sort of slip by and become accepted as fact. The same, of course, is true of the Prose Edda, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in Iceland circa 1220 AD. Again, pagan verbal sagas and poems retold from a Christian viewpoint, often with very obvious Christian ideas added in. The concept of hell, for example, as being a place of utter misery and despair, fire and brimstone, grinning devils, poking, screaming lost souls with pitchforks, whereas the pagan concept of hell, spelt with one L, and having the same name as the goddess who ruled over it, Hel, well, it was very far from that idea. It was just pretty much a continuation of life, people doing what they'd done previously. Given the Christian church's attitudes to things like sex, it seems more than likely that these retellings of old tales would have been sanitized, shall we say. But before we get into the details of what we know, or even don't know about it, there is a point worth mentioning about this subject in the Viking context. Now, Viking in the true meaning of that word, someone who went raiding or exploring or whatever they did when they got in a ship and went somewhere to do whatever it was. From conversations I've had on military subjects, where people are surprised that gay men can actually be soldiers, and they can fight just as well as straight men, sometimes even better, despite some of the greatest names in military history having come from the LGBT community. Well, not that it was known as that in those days. Alexander the Great, he did pretty well. Conquered most of the known world. That was good. Julius Caesar, whose affair with King Nicomedes of Bithynia earned him the nickname the Queen of Bithynia. The famous crusader, King Richard the Lionheart. King Frederick the Great of Prussia, the foremost military genius of the 18th century. And Lord Kitchener of Khartoum, famous for that World War I poster of him with a large mustache and pointing out from the poster, "Your country needs you." Yeah, despite all that, many people are still amazed that gay men can be soldiers because they have a totally incorrect, stereotyped idea of gay men. So to say there could be gay Vikings, well, that will inevitably bring the response of, how could those ferocious, hairy men with big axes, the very epitome of masculinity, be gay? Well, yeah, just the way gay people could be anything else, I suppose. And plenty of straight men would make pretty use of soldiers, or Viking raiders as well, for that matter. But there will still be those who will see it through stereotyped glasses and regard the very idea of a gay Viking as nothing more than a joke. Oh, I simply can't go raiding, darling. I mean, that great big axe thing. I mean, swing that and, I might break a fingernail. Ooh. Yes, let us move swiftly on. From what we do know, given clues here and there in these old writings, was that reproduction was of paramount importance to the Old Norse, since theirs was an agricultural society. Now, something that might come as a surprise to a lot of people who have the popular image of Vikings as being nothing but raiders. That's all they did 365 days a year, pillaging and looting all over the place. Well, some of them did. And I have to stress some of them. But what about all the people who stayed at home while they were doing it? The entire village or town didn't pile into a longship and sail off somewhere. And they couldn't have even if they wanted to, since the largest ships could only carry about 80 men. Most of the population remained at home, and as a society, they relied principally on agriculture and fishing. Crops being grown and harvested, animals reared for meat and clothing, eggs collected, fish caught. All things that, you couldn't really bring back from somewhere in a longship. If Ivar comes home with a load of gold and silver that he's just got over in England, let's say, but there's no bread on the table. There's no meat to eat, no milk, no eggs, because everybody who should have been ploughing fields and such things was off with him, raiding, and nobody was tending the land. It's now going into winter, there's no crops. Well, he's got a big problem. But an agricultural society, of course, requires plenty of people to work the land, obviously. So having children was vital to one's survival, especially in an age before social welfare, old age pensions, retirement homes, and the like had been invented. As you grew older and less able to work the farm or go out and fish or go raiding for that matter, it was important to have children and grandchildren, as many as possible to keep things going and to look after you in your old age. So reproduction was important to the social structure as a whole and to each individual family member as well. Any sex that didn't produce a result 9 months later was, well, it was really a waste of valuable resources, you might say. There are indications that if you got married and had children, the important business taken care of as far as society was concerned, then whatever you might do after that, well, it wasn't really as important as it might otherwise be. Your future sexual partners wouldn't have had the same repercussions that they would have done had you failed to do what was expected of you and not reproduced. And of course, kept your later intimate desires, well, discreet. Keep it behind closed doors. Don't shout it from the rooftops. You've been a good Norseman or woman and you've made babies. Nobody's really going to care very much what you're doing after that. But at least appearing to follow all the accepted rules of society would be beneficial. And actually producing an offspring or two, well, that would be a considerable advantage. Since trying to avoid marriage, no, that was actually penalized, regardless of why someone might be doing it. That didn't matter. The reason you didn't want a marital partner was really irrelevant. Having one was expected. It was your duty, not only to your family, but to your community, to marry and to produce children, to keep that community going. A man who tried to duck out of a partnership was called a fullfloggy, meaning one who flees from the female organ in that case. And a woman doing the same was a framflogge, with the same meaning the other way around, running away from the male organ. So trying to avoid marriage for whatever reason was a recognized thing that you did not do in Norse society. And of course, having no sexual desire for someone, I suppose, would be a very good reason for not wanting to marry them or be forced to produce children, though you might not want to announce that publicly at the Althing. The Old Norse, they had a rather curious attitude towards intimate relations between men, not exactly forbidding it nor finding it shameful, provided it was done in a particular way. That was very important. It wasn't taboo as such, regardless of how it happened, but one had to be careful about the position in which one did it. And I'm not talking about something out of the Kama Sutra when I say that. There was this surprising double standard involving masculine superiority, I suppose. What might be seen as the dominating male part of the process regarded as superior to the submissive female role. Of course, in the context of making children, both roles are equally important. You really can't have one without the other. But that aspect of the business wasn't considered. There was, it seems, nothing whatsoever shameful or degrading about a man having sexual intercourse with another man. But only if he were acting in the male role, only if he was in charge. To put it bluntly, if he was the one on top. That was still manly. After all, rape was an integral part of raiding, along with the pillaging and looting and burning. Actually, probably a very popular part of it. And not just by the Vikings. It was part and parcel of all warfare across Europe. But it was seen as a masculine thing to do. And sexual aggression against vanquished enemies in order to show them that they were subjugated, to prove to them that they were vanquished. Well, that was also used. Captives, both male and female, sometimes being raped just as an example, which was also the case in very masculine-orientated societies in other parts of the world as well, not just the Vikings. How extensive its use was by the Vikings, well, we really don't know. It may have been infrequent or relatively common, but it was done just as it was in other lands as well. So the man who was taking the non-shameful part, despite the fact that he was doing it to a man and not a woman, was not regarded as being shameful or effeminate, simply masculine and showing his dominant will. But the poor guy on the bottom, the one taking the submissive, passive female role, well, now that was a different story altogether. He would be the subject of derision. He could be called ergi, which meant one who was effeminate, unmanly, possibly even cowardly, one who played the role of the woman in sexual intercourse, even if he hadn't actually had any choice in the matter. Men who practiced the art of Seder, the almost exclusively female form of shamanic magic, also ran the risk of being seen in the same light as ergi, because they took a woman's role voluntarily. Now, of course, again, I have to say everything that we know about Old Norse beliefs and customs comes to us in Christian retelling. But that this does seem more what we might expect from the pagan attitudes rather than the Christian. Homosexuality wasn't what was seen as wrong in itself from a pagan viewpoint. It wasn't regarded as evil or perverted as such a dreadful travesty of nature, nor a man involved with it, unless he took the female role. a man who permitted himself to be used in that way. What kind of man does that? It was the submissive role, rather than the sexual act itself, that was considered unmanly. And to willingly take a woman's part in sexual matters, well, you see, that could suggest a man will be the same in everything else. He'd tend to lean towards a woman's attitude. He wouldn't be a real man, standing up for himself, asserting himself, being the first one into battle. He wouldn't live up to what was expected of a Norseman. A strong leader ready to march out in front and take command of a situation. It wasn't the sex act as such that was condemned, it was the man's submissive attitude to it. But the Christian church, well, they took a very different attitude and condemned any sexual relations between men, active or submissive, on top, underneath. It was all the same to the early church. Both were equally condemned. So it would seem that accounts of the Norse attitude on that subject are probably correct. Now, for example, in Iceland, the civil law codes that would have been drawn up at the Althing before the Christian times, back in the Viking Age, they made no mention of sexual relations between men. Whatever it might be thought of in actuality, there was no legal restriction on it. It was legal, but it was legal insofar as it wasn't actually illegal. And it was only when church law came into force that it was specifically mentioned. One church document, dated circa 1200 AD, known as the Icelandic Homily Book, states that a horrendous crime is committed by those appalling secret sins perpetrated by men who respect men no more than women. And it brings bestiality into it as well, by adding to the list those who violate quadrupeds. Now, couldn't have that sort of thing going on. Oh. In a list of the penances to be performed, written around the latter part of the 12th century, 10 years of penances and a good flogging is mentioned for adultery between men. And once again, evil sins committed by men on quadrupeds. Ah, yes. Of a woman-to-woman relationship, it states, if women satisfy one another, they shall be given the same penance as men who perform the most hideous adultery between them, or with a quadruped. You know, what this concern about quadrupeds was all about, I really don't know. I mean, what were they getting up to in Iceland at that time? And remember, this is not pagans we're talking about. No, this is long after the conversion of Iceland to Christianity, which took place in the year 1000 AD. It does bring to mind the saying that in days of old, men were men, and sheep were worried. Yes. Now, one could be severely insulted in Old Norse times by being linked, likened, or any suggestion made that the man could be anything like an animal that could reproduce. Anything that had a womb and could produce offspring was an insult. So to tell a man he was, well, reminiscent of a cow or a nanny goat, a doe or a vixen, was to offer grave offence. And it could result in the one making the suggestion finding a grave of their own. And that applied to gods as well as mortals, as in the case of Loki, for example, who was greatly shamed for having given birth to the 8-legged horse Sleipnir after his fling with the stallion Svadilfari while shapeshifted into the form of a mare, even though he did it at the behest of the other gods to help them get out of an agreement that they didn't want to honour. And it says in the sagas, Loki had such dealings with Svadilfari that sometime after he bore a foal. The shame stuck with him, despite his sort of making amends by giving the animal, said to be the finest of all horses, as a gift to Odin. And even Odin himself was accused, oddly enough, by Loki, who was really hardly in a position to criticize others after giving birth to a horse. He was accused of being ergi himself, due to his practice of Seder magic, taught to him by the goddess Freya at his own request, because to do so was regarded as doing the work of women. A man could also be insulted by references to male animals as well, given the context. One particular insult of that kind was to call a man Grani's bride, Grani being the stallion ridden by the great hero Sigurd. Now, there are tiny plaques of beaten gold that have been discovered in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, known as Gullgubba, which means little old golden man, dating from the late Iron Age, circa 550 to 800 AD, though the exact dating is a bit difficult. The name recorded in a report of 1791 in Sweden, which stated that this was the name given to them by villagers in one area where many of them have been found. And to date, some 3,000 have been found. They often depict men and women shown facing one another and embracing or just holding each other's arms, which have been seen as representing the female Jotun or giant Gerda, and the god associated with fertility, Freya. And some archaeologists think they may have been used at weddings, for example, signifying sexual unions. Others suggest the figures are actually dancing. Actually, we have no idea what they're doing. But there are two of these little gold plaques that deserve closer examination because they show two people of the same sex apparently embracing, dancing, or whatever it was they're actually doing. One shows a couple with distinctive female long braided hair, obvious breasts, and wearing dresses. Not embracing as such, but rather holding each other by the arm. The other one showing two people with beards, unlikely to be women, who have their arms on each other's waists. Could these actually depict same-sex couples? Yes, it's possible, but we must consider other possibilities as well. Societies in which, men and women danced separately, for example, often facing each other, but not actually making anything in the way of physical contact, or where men and women danced only with those of their own sex. Here in Ireland, in not too distant times, men and women actually sat on opposite sides of the country dance halls. The ballrooms of romance, as they were often called. Not that there was ever very much romance to be found there. The parish priest saw to that. But they're very restricted as far as any real contact between the sexes. And when they actually got up to dance, they didn't really touch each other. It was all very proper. As Kenny Everett used to say on his BBC programme, it was all done in the best possible taste. Now, these little gold figures could simply be dances, two men or two women dancing together, or they could just represent two friends greeting one another. There really is no way to tell for certain. Now, the poses are unusual, to be sure, but there were various forms of the Gulgaber. Sometimes just a single figure, animals on others, or a tree sometimes was shown between the figures. These two are the only ones to show couples of the same sex doing whatever it was they were doing, which might indeed indicate a genuine same-sex relationship, given how few of this type there are, 2 out of 3,000. I suppose you could say it's evidence that could support the same-sex theory if that's what you want it to support. Or it could be nothing more than a symbol of friendship. Or simply the two of those little plaques just happened to get made that way in a flight of fancy by some goldsmith after he consumed too much mead, and they signify nothing whatsoever. Once again, I must stress that all speculation on this subject, and indeed much else about the Viking Age, depends on verbal tales handed down by word of mouth for well over 200 years before somebody who didn't believe in them wrote them down. A good way to view it would be like this. If someone were to ask an old person here in Ireland to tell them what their grandfather said his grandfather told him that he'd been told by his great-grandmother about an event in Irish history that she'd heard all about from her great-aunt, whose brother remembered somebody or other telling him about it. Let's say the rebellion of 1798. And then it's written down by someone who changes bits of it that people might not today agree with or would be frowned on by sections of the community. There you would have something very similar to what we have when it comes to the written records of the Old Norse in the Eddas. But now, there are a few accounts of various things from travellers and merchants who visited the Northlands, but by and large, everything we have comes from these second-hand sources of sometimes rather questionable accuracy. That's pretty much all that can be said about Norse homosexuality. If you have enjoyed this video, please like, and I hope you'd consider subscribing to my channel. And a share would be greatly appreciated, as I can assure you. So, for now, I shall say farewell and goodbye until next time.